Hello and welcome to video number 2 in this series of videos on Goethe's novels. Today I'm going to be talking about a couple of important aspects of his first novel, The Sorrows of Young Werther, Die Leiden des jungen Werther, or you could also say The Sufferings of Young Werther. My comments today all center on a single concept, and that is nature. As soon as we start reading this novel, we see that Goethe is interested in nature and that he wants to put it at the heart of his book. Of course, we have to understand nature in the widest sense. We're not simply talking about trees and flowers and insects, although we are talking about that too, but we are talking about nature as it pervades the universe. We're talking about nature as creation. We're talking about nature as the face of divinity, the face of the cosmos. We're talking about human nature. And it is with human nature that he begins his novel. Let's have a look at the very first couple of sentences of the very first letter, which Werther writes to his friend on the 4th of May, 1771. He says, "How glad I am to have got away. My dear friend, what a thing is the heart of man." And I just have to pause here for a moment, because what Goethe wrote was not what a thing is the heart of man. Goethe wrote, "Bester Freund, was ist das Herz des Menschen?" My dear friend, what is the human heart? So please, every time you read the word man in this translation, remember that Goethe is almost invariably using the word human being. Okay, let's stick to the degendered version. And this is important because Goethe is not just talking about men, he's talking about the essence of the human organism. I'm not going to say that he was a gender-neutral writer. He most certainly wasn't, and most certainly not in this book. But it's important to identify the level at which he talks about human nature as something shared by all human beings, irrespective of gender. And I think it might not be pushing it too far to say irrespective of race, creed, and ethnicity, although he was never explicit about this. His friend Werther was. So he starts with the question of human nature, which is going to dominate the book. What is the heart? What is the human heart? What actually is it? What is passion? How do we think about it? What do we do about it? And this is going to be the way he uses the word nature in its very first instance, a very enigmatic question. He's talking cryptically about a love affair that he's abandoned, and he asks a series of questions. Am I wholly blameless? Did I not encourage her emotions? Did I not find pleasure in those genuine expressions of nature which, though but little amusing in reality, so often made us laugh? What are these genuine expressions of nature? They are most probably some kind of a deep urge which is not curbed by social convention, and if so, then we're going to be seeing a lot more of these urges as the novel progresses. We could call them drives as well. Following this cryptic reference to a failed love affair, he then goes on to allude to matters of business and commerce, and then he gets down to what is going to be one of his central passions, and that is a love of nature. Nature now in the sense in which we generally tend to understand it. And he says, I'm very well off here. Solitude in this terrestrial paradise is a wonderful balm to my emotions, and the early spring warms with all its fullness my often shivering heart. Every tree, every bush is a bouquet of flowers, and one might wish oneself transformed into a cockchafer to float about in this ocean of fragrance and find in it all the food one needs. a cockchafer. I'm not quite sure what that is. The German says Marienkäfer, and I think I would have translated that as a ladybug or something like that. A little insect, a little bug. The point is, he wants to become minuscule. He wants to lose his human form. He wants to be able to dissolve into nature. He wants to become like the rest of nature. And why? Because it is in nature that divinity is to be experienced. It is in nature that divinity reveals itself. God in nature, this essential pantheistic idea, which for Goethe in the 1770s was very attractive. But Goethe, like everything he was interested in, like all the scientific and philosophical principles that he was interested in, was not completely willing to go along with this idea. In fact, I think Thomas Saine is correct in observing that there is something pantheistic, but not quite pantheistic, about this novel. This movement from nature as human nature and the nature of the human heart to nature as nature all around us in the first letter is characteristic of a central problem of the novel. And Goethe, in characteristic fashion, reveals this central problem at the very beginning of the novel. Have a look at the few lines by way of introduction at the very beginning, even before this first letter. Read this carefully, and you're going to see a very interesting opposition develop in it. This is the voice of the editor or the narrator saying that he has gathered the letters together that tell Werther's stories. And he observes about Werther, his mind and character can't but win your admiration and love, his destiny your tears. His mind and character, in other words, his nature, that which he carries within him, they win our admiration, and his fate deserves our tears. His fate, what nature outside of him brought on him. Okay, the distinction seems easy, but the entire book problematizes this distinction. What did he carry within him as his own nature, and what was it that external circumstances, the nature of life and the nature of the world and the nature of society, brought to his story? The second paragraph of this little introduction continues with that same split, that same distinction, where the narrator speaks and says, "You, good soul, who feel the same urge as he does." Okay, we feel an urge, we feel a drive, our inner nature telling us to do something. We're now supposed to stand back, use our rational minds, and take comfort from his sufferings. Let this book be your friend, if due to fate or personal responsibility you can find no closer one. Again, if you have no friends, is it fate or is it personal responsibility? Probably a question that we ask ourselves again and again when we find ourselves in problematic relationships with friends. All right, so let's hold on to this idea. Let's hold on to this sense that there is a problem in understanding nature, understanding human life, whether it comes from within or comes from without. Because this is also a political issue in this novel. And this has been pointed out time and again. I just want to repeat it, though. Nicholas Boyle put it rather nicely in the first volume of his biography of Goethe, which I've already recommended to you. He's talking about the fashion of sentimentality that Goethe was kind of flirting with at the time, but didn't, in characteristic form again, didn't completely fall for. And Boyle speaks of the dilemma posed for sentimentality by its assumption that at the center of each unique individual's world lies a unique faculty of sensibility. Werther's talking about this when he talks about how he sees nature. It's supposed to be completely private, Boyle says, and yet it's the source of all the relationships that hold between the individual and the world around. And this is exactly what Werther is going to start exploring. And he's going to discover that the world around is not only structured by the laws of nature, but it's also structured by the laws of society, with its legal prescriptions, and also with its moral prescriptions. In his book on Goethe, the famous critic Georg Lukács, in his book written in 1947, is going to take this politics of nature even further, and he's going to say that at the center of Werther is the major problem of bourgeois revolutionary humanism, the problem of the free and full development of the human personality. And we can take this as Goethe's project. We're going to see this in the next novel, in the Bildungsroman, in the Wilhelm Meister novels, where the center of the novel is the free and full development of the human personality. It is the prerequisite for a just politics. And this is what this is the way that Lukács reads the book. He goes so far as to say that Werther is the proclamation of the ideals of revolutionary humanism, but it's also the perfect formulation of the tragic contradiction of these ideals. The ideal here in Werther would be the full and free development of the individual according to their inner design, if I can put it that way, but then the same simultaneous curtailment of this by the rules of society and by the structure of society, and following Lukács by the class structure of society. And we can follow this politics through, and we will discover that the politics of nature extends to every aspect of Werther's life, and it extends to all the aspects which he takes most seriously. His creativity, the question of representation, and it extends to love itself. And it's in his love relationship that we see this contradiction, this tension within human nature play itself out most extremely. And Angus Nichols talks about this. He talks about how the human heart seems to be inscribed with its own natural law, but that it's an act of faith to see this natural law as somehow aligning automatically with the laws of society. What guarantees that this will happen? I don't think it's saying too much to claim that the politics of nature cut the human being in half. Werther is free to make his own choices. He's free to do as he pleases. He can press himself on Lotte, he can force himself on her to the point where she wants in the end to have nothing to do with him, even though she's apparently in love with him. That's a controversial claim. Not everybody would agree with me, but I think it's pretty clear that she's just as much in love with him as he is with her. But Lotte has a well-developed moral sense, a conscience, a superego, which Werther more or less lacks. So freedom for Werther leads in the end to the ultimate freedom, and that is the freedom to take his own life. So he may have begun as a seemingly contemplative soul who wants to immerse himself intellectually, artistically, passionately in nature, both human nature and nature at large. But in the end, he reveals himself as committed to action, and to moral action, to correct action. Moral action for him, and this was a problem for many of the readers of the book, moral action in the end forces him to take his own life. In summary, the schism within Werther's heart that tears him apart and leaves suicide the only option is a schism which is built into every aspect of the book. And I'd like you to return again to the very first letter and look for the series of antinomies that characterize it. Let me just briefly state what I mean when I say the series of antinomies that characterize this first letter. We have the competing claims that life should be structured by passion and that it should be structured by reflection, understanding. We have the competing claims that fate rules life and that responsibility rules life. The competing claims that the imagination is the most important aspect of life and that experience is the most important aspect. We have the competing claims that self-preservation happens best through business and wealth and accumulating money and logically ordering one's daily affairs, on the one hand, or on the other hand, that self-preservation is something guaranteed by nature. And then finally, we have the competing claims that life is better lived in the city and that it's better lived in the country. And I think it's interesting to look at all of these claims as structuring the political content of the novel. Because later on, in the episode where Werther finds his way into the noble society of the court, we're going to find all of this given a class dimension. Werther is the person whose nature promises to him that it will raise him above class divisions, but class divisions slap him down again. And this is one of the straws that will break the camel's back. Good. That is enough about the politics of nature in Werther. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I will see you again soon.